I want to be clear about something before I tell this story. I was 13 years old. I weighed 51 kilograms. Holding a pitchfork I didn't know how to use. And my hands were shaking badly enough that the tines were rattling against each other, like loose change in a tin cup. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound brave. I'm telling you this because if you think what I did was brave, you've misunderstood the story. What I did was refuse to move, which is a different thing entirely. Anyone can refuse to move. You just stay where you are and keep breathing. The hard part, as it turned out, was breathing. The pack came on a Tuesday in late autumn, when the light over the Kethavar Basin goes flat and white, and the frost hasn't settled yet, but you can feel it thinking about it. 7 of them, coming in low over the tree line, from the eastern ridge, their wing shadows moving across the fields before they did. I heard them before I saw them. That low harmonic, not wind, not an engine, something older than either, that rolls through your chest cavity and makes your body want to do something instinctive before your brain has time to weigh in. My body wanted to run. I'm not ashamed to say that. I was 13 and there were 7 of them. I didn't run. I stayed in the doorway of the old equipment shed and I kept both hands on the pitchfork, which was a piece of theatrical idiocy on my part. Because the pitchfork was for mucking out stalls, not for anything that mattered. I think on some level I knew that, but I stayed. Inside the shed behind me, Veth was awake. I could hear her, that soft, layered sound. Part breath, part something else, the thing that wasn't quite a hum, that she made when she was frightened. She'd been making it, on and off for the last 2 days. Ever since the food disappeared from the bowl, I'd set out in the south field as a signal. She knew they were coming before I did. That told me something I tried not to think about too hard at the time. If she was frightened of them, they weren't coming to give her a birthday present. 6 weeks earlier, I had found her in the irrigation culvert at the bottom of our south field. I want to tell you exactly what that was like, because the story later gets to the part where things are very large and very important, and the sky fills up with more dragons than I'd seen in my life. And I don't want you to lose track of what the beginning looked like. The beginning looked like a culvert. Concrete cracked about 1.5 meters of clearance inside it. It ran under the access road at the bottom of our property and emptied into the seasonal drainage ditch on the far side. My family's land was not glamorous. It was a mid-sized working property on the outer edge of the Toval settlement cluster. Grain storage, some livestock, my father's contract maintenance work on the coalition agricultural grid. We grew things and fixed things and drove 20 minutes into town for anything that required more than 3 choices. I found her on a Wednesday afternoon, which I remember because Wednesdays were when my mother sent me to clear the culvert head of whatever the seasonal runoff had deposited since the previous week. Leaves, mostly, sometimes a dead bird, once memorably a child's boot. I went with a bucket and a pair of long gloves, and I came back with whatever the week had contributed to the general mess of the world. That Wednesday, what the week had contributed was a dragon. She was curled in the back third of the culvert, and the first thing I noticed was that she smelled like forge smoke, and something sweet I didn't have a word for. And the second thing I noticed was that she was about the size of a large dog, and she was watching me with 2 amber eyes that reflected my headlamp back at me like mirrors. I stopped moving. She stopped moving. We regarded each other for what felt like a reasonable amount of time. She had deep blue-black scales, the kind of color that's not quite black, not quite blue, that shifts when the light catches it, oil on water, or the inside of a mussel shell. Her wing membranes were darker still, almost charcoal, and the left one was held wrong, not folded the way the right one was. Held at an angle that made me think of the word wrong, the way you think it about an arm that bends in a Shen arms don't bend. She was injured. That much was clear. The rest was not immediately clear. I was 13. My experience with dragons was twice. From a distance on the Kethavar horizon, something big moving against the sky that my father pointed to and said was a Vorath survey flight. That was the extent of it. Dragons existed. They were large, they were old, they kept to themselves, and they had roughly the same relationship to our daily lives as the weather satellite 300 kilometers overhead. Present, not personal. This one was personal. This one was 4 feet away and watching me with a focus that I found extremely difficult to interpret. What I did, which I maintain was the correct thing, was put down my bucket and sit cross-legged on the culvert floor and not move. I didn't reach for her. I didn't make sudden noises. I sat and I waited, and after about 10 minutes, she put her head down on her forelegs and closed one eye. I went home for dinner. I told no one. I went back after dark with a piece of cooked meat from the icebox that I was fairly sure was meant for tomorrow's lunch, and I left it at the culvert entrance and went back to bed. In the morning, it was gone. I want to be honest about my reasoning, which was not complicated. She was hurt and she was hiding, and whatever she was hiding from was not obvious, and the most important question seemed to be, what does something hurt and hiding need? The answer I arrived at was, food and quiet and to be left alone by things that are going to make the situation worse. I was reasonably confident I could provide all three. What I was not confident about was the wing. I'd watched it for 3 days and it wasn't getting better, and I knew enough from my father's work to know that something that isn't getting better is either getting worse or getting very good at hiding the fact that it's getting worse. On the 4th day, I brought my mother's old veterinary handbook. She'd done 3 years of animal medicine before the money ran out and she pivoted to bookkeeping. And I sat outside the culvert and read the section on avian wing injuries twice. The handbook was not, technically, about dragons. I made some adjustments. On the 5th day, I brought a length of clean canvas. And what I was fairly certain was the configuration of support wrapping based on the handbook's diagrams, plus my own observations. And I sat at the entrance of the culvert for the better part of an afternoon, and Veth. I had started calling her Veth because she'd made a sound once that sounded approximately like that, and he didn't seem to object. Veth eventually let me close enough to look at the wing. Up close, she was extraordinary. The scales on her flanks were each individually edged with something that caught the light differently from the body of the scale. Not iridescent, exactly, like the way frost catches light. A faint and very precise shimmer at every edge. Her claws were the color of old bone, long and slightly curved, and she kept them very carefully away from me, which I appreciated. Her horns, 2 of them, swept back, the right one slightly longer than the left, were the same dark charcoal as her wing membranes. She weighed, I estimated, about 30 kilograms. Breath smelled like the forge, smoke, and sweet thing I'd noticed the first day. And from this distance I could add something faintly mineral to it, like rain on hot stone. I wrapped the wing. It took 3 attempts and she hissed at me twice, and the second hiss was the one that sounded approximately like Veth, and so that became her name. She didn't bite me. I think she considered it. She decided against it. I appreciate that decision to this day. The wing was wrong in the way I had suspected. Something in the leading joint had been forced into an angle it wasn't built for. Not broken, I didn't think. Badly wrenched. The support wrap was not going to fix it. But it was going to stop her from using it wrong while it healed, which was the next best thing. She tolerated the wrap for 1 day, and then removed it with the kind of precise and contemptuous efficiency that made me feel she had waited, specifically for me to go home before dismantling my work. I wrapped it again. She removed it again. I wrapped it again. She removed it and then, as far as I could tell, went to sleep on top of it, which I chose to interpret as a compromise. The wing healed slowly over the following weeks. My family knew something was going on. My parents were not stupid people. My mother noticed the missing food. My father noticed that I was spending significantly more time in the Southfield than the Southfield required. My younger sister was 9 and had the observational instincts of a surveillance drone. Told me at dinner one evening that she knew I was keeping something in the culvert, and that she wanted to see it. I told her I was keeping a very large and bad-tempered toad in the culvert, and that she should not go near it. She looked at me for a long moment in the way she looked at things she was filing for later use. Toads don't eat that much, she said. She'd apparently counted the missing food. It's a very big toad, I said. My parents exchanged a look across the table that I was not meant to see and that I absolutely saw. My father said nothing. My mother said nothing. This was, I would understand later, a form of permission. A deliberate leaving of room. They were letting me handle something. They were watching to see if I could. I moved Veth from the culvert to the old equipment shed on the 14th day, which was partly practical. The shed had a wood stove, and the nights were getting cold. And partly because the culvert was getting too small for her. She was growing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently. The dishes I'd been filling were being emptied faster. The space she occupied was more of a space. The equipment shed was largely unused. The real machinery being kept in the main barn. It had a stove, a water trough, a stack of old grain bags that made a serviceable bed, and a window on the east wall through which the morning light came in broad, and warm in a way I found comfortable, and that Veth, after some investigation, also seemed to find acceptable. She claimed the morning light within 24 hours. I accepted this. The shed was big enough for both of us. What happened in the shed over the following weeks was not dramatic. It was quiet. She slept a great deal, the way injured things sleep, deeply and completely, the kind of sleep that is work. I fed her. I changed the grain bags when they needed changing. I sat with her in the evenings after my schoolwork was done and read aloud. Because I'd read somewhere that it helped injured animals to have a consistent human voice nearby. And because I didn't know what else to do with my hands while I was waiting for her to be better. She listened. I know that sounds like the kind of thing you say about an animal because you're projecting. But I'm saying it as a fact. She listened. She would orient toward my voice. When I stopped reading, she would sometimes make the small layered sound, the one that was not quite a hum, and I would keep going. I read her a great deal of agricultural regulation literature from my father's work files, because that was what was on the shelf above the stove. And if she had opinions about it, she kept them to herself. Volume 7 of the Toval Outer Settlement Maintenance Codes, which covered drainage easement protocols and seasonal access agreements, seemed to provoke no strong reaction either way. The quarterly coalition grid audit summaries, which were dry even by the standards of the genre, appeared to function as a mild sedative. I considered this a success. The goal was not educational, it was presence. What I was learning, in those quiet evenings, was something I didn't have the vocabulary for at 13, but that I've thought about a great deal since. Injured things need specific conditions to heal. They need the wound to be addressed. That was the wing, the canvas, the handbook, the ongoing negotiation about the wrap. But they also need something underneath the wound. The assurance that the environment is stable, that nothing new is going to go wrong, that the air is not full of threat. You can't heal while you're braced for the next thing to happen. Some part of your system that should be going toward repair keeps getting redirected into vigilance. I was providing the stable air. That was my job. Not glamorous work. Not visible work, mostly, but the wing healed. There were 3 weeks in the middle where I was worried it wasn't going to. That had been forced. Whatever had done it with enough force that the surrounding tissue was, I thought, taking longer to settle than the handbook suggested it should. She was eating well. She was sleeping. She was not, as far as I could tell, in significant pain, or if she was not showing it in ways I recognized. But the wing extension tests she did every morning, each one slightly more ambitious than the last, kept stopping at the same point. A ceiling. Something not quite free. I went back to the handbook. I read the section on joint trauma 4 more times. I found a passage in the appendix, which I'd skimmed on the first read, about scar tissue formation in avian flight muscles and how certain types of injury laid down adhesive tissue that required movement. Careful, graduated, deliberate movement to break up rather than rest. Rest alone would calcify it. I was not certain this applied. The handbook was not, as established, written for dragons. I brought this to Veth the following morning with the specific feeling of someone who is about to suggest something to another person that the other person may not appreciate. I sat down in front of her in the morning light, and I pointed at the wing, not touching, just indicating, and I described, in the best language I had, what I thought the problem might be and what I thought might help. She watched me with those amber eyes the entire time. I finished. She held still for a moment. Then she extended the wing slowly to the point where it had been stopping and kept going. Not far. 5 degrees, maybe 10. But past the ceiling, she held it there. I watched. Then she folded it back and went to sleep on the grain bags with the specific decisiveness of someone who has resolved a matter and is moving on. I sat in the morning light for a little while after that, not doing anything, just sitting. It was one of the better mornings of my life, and I was 13 and didn't fully know it yet. The wing improved. She started extending it carefully, testing the range. The way you test a healed muscle, cautious, incremental, measuring against the memory of what it could do before. I watched this from across the shed, not approaching, letting her do it in her own time. On the 38th day she extended it fully. Both wings, the full span of her, and the shed was abruptly not large enough for the gesture, her right wingtip touching one wall, and her left falling just short of the other. And she held it for a long moment in the morning light, very still. I sat on the grain bags and didn't say anything, because there didn't seem to be anything to say. Then she folded them and went back to sleep. That night, the dish outside in the south field was empty in the morning. The signal I'd set, if something picked up the food I put out, at the edge of the field, something was looking. Something knew she was here. She'd been restless for 2 days, making the hum sound, watching the east window. I moved my bedroll into the shed on day 40 and slept on the grain bags next to her. She tolerated this. After 3 nights, she stopped making the sound at night, or at least stopped making it until morning, when she would make it at the window. Whatever was looking was getting closer. The morning they came, I was up before dawn. I'd been sleeping badly. Veth had spent most of the night sitting upright against the far wall, watching the door, and that's not a posture that is conducive to restful sleep in the person sleeping 8 feet away from her. I made myself tea on the shed's small stove, and I sat on the grain bags and watched her watch the door, and I thought about what I actually knew, which was the following. She'd been injured and hiding. She hadn't wanted to be found. Whatever had found the signal dish in the south field was not something she was relaxed about, and she was looking at the door in the way that things look at doors when they know what's on the other side is not going to wait much longer. I thought about waking my parents. I thought about what I would say if I did. I thought about the face my father would make. Not a fearful face, just a careful one, a measuring what's required face. And I thought about my sister. Absolutely get up and come out and try to pet whatever arrived. And I thought, not yet. Let me see what this is first. I will acknowledge operating on a significant information deficit. I finished my tea and I went to the shed door and I looked out at the sky. They were just visible against the early gray, coming in from the east ridge, lower than I would have expected. Wings spread in a long glide, 7 of them. The wingspans varied, some much larger than others, but the smallest of the 7 was still substantial, easily 5 times Veth's current size, and they were moving with the specific, deliberate quality of things that know exactly where they're going and intend to arrive. I stepped out of the shed, and I picked up the pitchfork that was leaning against the outer wall. I have reviewed this decision many times since. Pitchfork was for mucking out stalls. It was a tool. The idea that it would serve any defensive purpose against what was coming was so far outside the realm of the probable that it barely qualifies as optimistic. But my hands needed something to hold, and it was what was there, and that is the most honest explanation I can give. I stood in the doorway. I waited. They landed in the south field. Not all at once, sequentially, the largest first. A long, controlled descent that still managed to be enormous, in a way that made the air do something complicated around it. Pressure change you felt in your sinuses. Then the others, arranging themselves with a kind of casual precision that spoke of a group that had landed together many times before. No panic, no hurry, just the specific efficiency of something that does not need to prove it is large. The largest one stood at the front. I say she, because I understood this only later. At the time she was simply the largest. The one at the front, the one that everything else in the field seemed to organize itself around, stood and looked at the shed, then at me. The scales were iron gray with a deep copper trace in the ridges, a coloring that didn't show clearly at a distance, but was apparent now in the low light. Her eyes were the amber gold that I'd only ever seen in Veth, though Veth's were smaller and less settled, I think, is the word. This one's eyes were settled in the way that very old things are settled. Present and waiting and not rushed about it. I stood in the doorway with my poor fork. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. There was a pause. I have a theory, which mind over many years of thinking about this, that what happened in the next few seconds was functionally a recalibration. She arrived expecting something, a locked shed, an empty field, a frightened adult who'd bolted at their approach. Whatever she was expecting, I don't think it was a 13-year-old in barn clothes, holding a mucking fork and apparently attempting to look as if he belonged there. She dropped her head. Not a bow. Something more functional than that, the dragon equivalent of crouching to get at eye level. The head came down until her jaw was about a meter off the ground, and she was looking at me in a way that was less from above and more simply, across the space between us. I noticed, because it was impossible not to, that her teeth were visible when she lowered her head. She wasn't showing them as a threat. They were simply there, which was in some ways worse. "The hatchling," she said. Voice was not what I'd expected. Low, yes, and resonant in that harmonic way, but the words were precise. Continental standard, which my teacher had always said. I didn't speak with sufficient attention to the vowels. This one spoke it with impeccable attention to the vowels. "She is inside?" "Yes," I said. "You will step aside." "No," I said. There was a pause that had a different quality from the first one. "You are the one who has been keeping her," she said. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" 6 weeks. Another pause. One of the others, a mid-sized one with ash-gray scales and a deeper charcoal crest, made a sound low in its chest that I couldn't translate. The large one didn't acknowledge it. "You know what she is," the large one said. "Not a question. Not exactly," I said. "I know she was injured. I know she didn't want to be found. And I know she's been scared for 2 days, which I think is because she knew you were coming." The large one was very still. "She was scared," I said, "and she's not fully healed yet. And I'd like you to tell me, before I step aside, that you're not going to hurt her." The silence after that one was different again. I could feel the shift in it, the way you feel pressure changes before weather. "You believe," the large one said carefully, "that you are preventing me from hurting her." "I'm standing in a doorway with a pitchfork," I said. "I'm not confused about how strong I am. I'm asking you to tell me what you're going to do with her." One of the others made a sound. It took me a moment to understand it was laughter. Not the sound I associated with laughter, which is higher and faster. The slow, deep resonance of something large, finding something genuinely unexpected. The large one turned her head and looked at the laughing one. The laughter stopped. She looked back at me. "What is your name?" she said. "Kale Doss," I said. "What's yours?" Another pause. I counted them later. There were more pauses in that conversation than in most conversations I've had in the 50 years since. They were not empty pauses. They were the pauses of someone recalibrating in real time. "Drathcora," she said, "of the Veth-Soroth binding. Is that her family?" I said. "Veth? It is her bloodline," Drathcora said. "Veth is, yes, her bloodline. Is that why she was hiding? Because of whatever happened to her wing?" Copper-ridged head tilted. "You know about the wing." "I wrapped it," I said. "She took the wrap off. I wrapped it again. We did that for a while. It's mostly healed. She extended it fully 3 days ago." The shift in the field was palpable. Not in Drathcora. She was as still as before, but in the others. A collective adjustment. The ash-gray one made a sound I couldn't translate again, and this time Drathcora made a brief, low reply that was not in Continental Standard, and the ash-gray one went quiet. "You wrapped her wing," Cora said. "With canvas," I said. "I used an old veterinary handbook. It wasn't written for dragons specifically, but the underlying principles seemed applicable." I want to tell you that I said this calmly. Said it with approximately the same authority as someone who has no idea whether the underlying principles were applicable, but has decided that uncertainty is not a useful thing to broadcast. "Kals Doss," Drathcora said. "Yes, she is not fully healed. I know," I said. "I told you. What you are telling me is that you will not step aside until I have given you certain assurances." "Telling you I'd like to know what you're going to do with her," I said. "That's all. I'm not, look. If she needs to go with you, if her family's here and she needs to go home, then she should go home. I understand that. But she was scared, and I want to know she's going to be okay." Drathcora looked at me for a long time. The light was coming up properly now, flat white of the autumn morning sharpening into actual daylight, and in the better light I could see details I'd missed in the gray. The depth of the copper tracing in her ridge scales, the careful, weathered quality of them. She was not young. The way mountains are not young. She spoke over her shoulder in the other language. The ash-gray one responded. Then a third one, smaller, blue-black scales. A color that made my chest do something complicated, because I knew that color. Moved forward from the back of the group. I had not seen Veth's mother. I had not known there was a mother. The blue-black dragon moved past Drathcora and stopped about 5 meters from the shed door. She was larger than Veth, but smaller than the others. Younger, I thought, though what young meant at this scale was difficult to calibrate. The scales had the same oil-on-water shimmer at their edges, the same deep charcoal wing membranes. She was looking at me with amber eyes that were, unmistakably, Veth's eyes. She was also visibly. I understood this in the way you understand things that hit you all at once, waiting. Okay, I said after a moment. I stepped to the side. What happened next, I watched from outside, standing against the shed's outer wall, with the pitchfork still in my hands because I had forgotten to put it down. The blue-black dragon came through the doorway carefully, folding her wings tight, making herself as small as the space allowed. She didn't rush. Inside I could hear the hum sound, Veth sound, rise and then change, become something I hadn't heard before, something that the board of the shed seemed to vibrate with rather than just carry. Then quiet. Drathcora had not moved. The others had not moved. I stood against the wall and breathed and watched the sky getting lighter and thought about a thing my father had said once, which was that the most important work is almost always the work that nobody sees, and that this was fine, that not being seen was not the same as not mattering. I was 13 and I thought I understood that. I was not wrong, exactly, but I understood it shallowly. The depth of it came later. After a while the blue-black dragon came back out of the shed. Behind her Veth, pressed against her. Not hidden, not afraid, but close, her shoulder within a wingspan of the larger one, own wings held in a way that I knew by now meant ease. The amber eyes found me. Veth looked at me. I looked at Veth. She made the hum sound, and soft, the evening restful version. Okay, I said again. It was becoming my primary word. Drathcora moved. Not toward the shed, toward me. That same head lowering. That measured descent to something closer to eye level. The jaw a meter from the ground. The enormous copper-traced face about 3 meters away. The hatchling will return with her mother, she said. Good, I said. You have questions, she said. It was not a question. I want to know what happened to her wing, I said. I want to know how she ended up in my culvert. Drathcora regarded me. The wing was forced, deliberately, by a group that wanted something from her bloodline. She escaped. She was disoriented. She came to ground where she could. I thought about this. How old is she? In your terms, 7 years. 7. 7 was 2 years younger than my sister. She was alone for 2 days before I found her, I said. At least 2 days. Maybe more. Yes. And hurt. Yes. Okay, I said. I was quiet for a moment. Did you find the people who did it? The pause was different, shorter. Yes. Drathcora said. Okay, I said. Good. I put the pitchfork down against the shed wall. My hands were very aware of having nothing to hold. In my pockets. Kale Doss, Drathcora said. Yes, you wrapped her wing with canvas. And an agricultural veterinary handbook, I said. 1987, it's a bit out of date. The copper-traced head tilted again. The amber eyes, ancient, settled, warm in a way I hadn't anticipated warmth from something this size, were fixed on me with an attention that I found difficult to meet directly. Threatening, not cold, just entire, the kind of attention that doesn't miss things. She ate, Drathcora said. It wasn't directed at me exactly. More into the air between us, as if she were confirming something to herself. She slept, the wing was wrapped. Someone read to her. Agricultural regulation documents mostly, I said, and some maintenance manuals. It was what was on the shelf. One of the others made the deep resonant sound again. I was more confident now that it was laughter. She was frightened, Drathcora said. When we came. Yes, I said. She knew you were coming for 2 days and she was frightened. She did not know it was us, Drathcora said. She knew something was coming, and she was frightened, because the last time something came it hurt her wing. She paused. You stayed in the shed with her. Someone needed to. The silence that followed, that was the longest of all the silences that morning. The light was fully up now, white and clean, the frost-thinking cold sitting in the air, the south field silver with dew. I was aware that I was cold and tired, and that I should probably have told my parents what was happening, and that I hadn't, and that at some point there was going to be a reckoning with that. But that was a problem for a different hour. There is a name, Drathcora said, in the old Vethsorath language. I will tell it to you in your language, because the full form would take considerably more of your morning. I waited. Keth Kalin, she said. It means the one who stands in a doorway for reasons that cannot be explained on a form. The one who does not move when moving would be easier, and staying serves no clear purpose that a person could write down and file. She paused. We give this name rarely. It is not a title, it is a recognition.
Anything.
Kale Doss, she said. Keth Kalin, you are known to the Vethsorath binding. I thought about several responses and decided most of them were inadequate. Thank you, I said. Drathcora lifted her head back to its full height. The copper ridge scales caught the morning light in a way that was, I'll be honest with you, extraordinary. She spoke in the other language, briefly, over her shoulder, and the group began to move. Not away, not yet, but into a different arrangement. Less the arrival formation, and more simply a group of large beings resting in a field. The blue-black dragon came forward again, and Veth with her. And Veth stopped in front of me, with about a meter of space between us, and looked at me, with those amber eyes that had been the first thing I'd seen in the culvert 6 weeks ago. She was going to go. I knew that. She needed to go. Mother was here. Her family was here. The shed and the grain bags and the agricultural regulation documents had been a place to be while she healed, and she had healed, and this was the next part of her story, not mine. I reached out and put my hand very briefly on the ridge between her horns, the place she'd allowed me to touch, eventually, in the later weeks, when the trust had been built slowly and carefully in the way. Trust is built. When neither of you has a language the other speaks. She made the hum sound, the evening version, the restful one. Take care of that wing, I said. She held still for 3 more seconds, which was, I think, her version of taking a moment. Then she stepped back and turned and walked to her mother's side, and they went together across the south field. The group departed the way they'd arrived, sequentially the largest first, Drathcora in a long, sweeping ascent that displaced enough air to flatten the grass in a circle I could still see the mark of a week later. The others followed, and then the blue-black dragon and Veth, and I stood in the field and watched the fishing shadows cross the silver grass, and then lift, and then the sky was just the sky. My sister was standing at the field gate. I don't know how long she'd been there, long enough. The 1987 veterinary handbook was open in her hands. She'd found it in the sheds at some point, apparently, and her expression was the one that meant she had questions, but was deciding which order to ask them in. So, she said. So, I said. Not a toad, she said. Not a toad, I said. She looked at the sky where they'd gone, then back at me. Are you in trouble? I thought about it. I don't think so, I said. Mum is going to have things to say about the food. I know. And about sleeping in the shed. I know. She looked at me with the drone surveillance eyes. Was she scared? She asked. The hatchling. At first, I said. Less, later. My sister looked at the sky again. The look had shot sometimes, the one that was more than 9 years old. Good, she said. And she closed the handbook and turned and went back up toward the house. I stood in the field for another minute. The frost had settled now, really, the grass crunching softly under my boots when I shifted my weight. The shed door was open. The morning light falling through it onto the empty grain bags, the water trough, the stove, cold. Picked up the pitchfork on my way past it and hung it back on its nail inside the shed door. Then I went in to deal with my parents. My mother's reaction was better than I'd feared, and exactly what I'd expected, which is a contradiction that describes my mother precisely. My father listened to the whole thing from start to finish, without interrupting once, which also describes my father precisely. My sister ate her breakfast and watched us all with the look that meant she was filing everything. The wing, my mother said finally. Canvas, I said. I used your handbook. She was quiet for a moment. From 1987. It was on the shelf. Kale, she said with a particular inflection. Principles were applicable, I said. My father made a sound into his tea that might have been a great many things, and was probably all of them. We didn't talk about it much after that, which was the way my family handled things that were large and complete. You acknowledged them, You confirmed they were real, and then you got on with the morning. The shed got cleaned out and restocked. The veterinary handbook went back on its shelf. The grain bags were replaced. The scorch mark where the stove's exhaust had been running slightly too hot got repaired. 2 weeks later, a delegation arrived at our property. 3 Veth binding members, not the full group, a smaller and more formal visit. They spoke to my parents for a long time. I sat at the table and listened and was not sent out of the room, which I took to mean that whatever was being discussed concerned me and that my parents had decided I had the right to hear it. The discussion covered several things I understood imperfectly, and one thing I understood very well, which was, the blue-black dragon's name was Velketh Sora, and she was not simply a member of the binding, but the matriarch designate of the Sora branch, which was, as the delegation explained, with a careful and slightly labored patience that I recognized as the quality of people who were explaining, something they weren't entirely sure how to scale down without losing. Consequential. The hatchling was her youngest. The people who had hurt the hatchling's wing had known this. The hiding had been deliberate and necessary, and had worked because the culvert was about the last place anyone would think to look. There were, the delegation explained, 7 Sora branch members who had spent 6 weeks searching. 7. Not the pack that had arrived in our field. That was a different group, the recovery team, the ones Drathkora led. 7 other members, different search corridors, none of them finding what they were looking for until the signal food disappeared from the Southfield dish. Thought about this. 6 weeks, 7 searchers. Why didn't they find her sooner? I asked. The culvert's not that far from the main access road. The lead delegation member looked at me with that careful, measured quality. Because she did not want to be found, she said. She was concealing herself. Actively. Of her bloodline has searchline capacities. For not being seen. Thought about the 6 weeks I'd spent feeding her, reading to her, sitting in the morning light. The way she'd watched me from the culvert, the amber eyes in the headlamp. She wanted to be found by me, I said. It wasn't quite a question. The delegation member was quiet for a moment. She permitted herself to be found, she said, which is a different thing, and which I have thought about the difference between for 50 years. "'Kay," I said. "And she permitted you to stay," the delegation member added, "which is not something a Sora hatchling does lightly." She looked at me directly. "You were cleaning the culvert." "Wednesday afternoons," I said. "It was my job." She looked at my parents, then back at me. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that the light shifts when a cloud passes, change in quality rather than direction. "Yes," she said, so we are told. The delegation stayed for 2 hours and departed with what I can only describe as correctness. Formal, measured, considered. The delegation stayed for 2 hours and departed with what I can only describe as correctness. Formal, measured, considered. The lead member paused at the door and looked back at me. "Keth Kalin," she said, was the first time anyone other than Drathkora had said it to me. It landed differently the second time. More real, somehow, more settled. The way a name becomes more itself the more times it is spoken. "Yes," I said. "The binding knows where you live," she said. I wasn't entirely sure how to take that. "That's fine," I said. She made a sound that might, in the right light, have been a smile. Then she left. Years passed. This is the part of the story where time is supposed to compress elegantly, and I suppose it does. You can't tell every year of a life, and the telling is not the point. The point is what the naming meant, which I understood more clearly as I grew older, and what it did not mean, which I also learned more clearly with time. It did not mean I became something I wasn't. I remained, in the basic facts of the matter, a person who grew up on a working property, on the outer edge of the Toval settlement cluster, and went to school in town, and later went to university, and later worked in agricultural systems management, which is a profession that sounds less interesting than it is, and involves a great deal of the kind of careful, unspectacular maintenance work that my father had done, and that I found, to my not surprise, that I was suited to. I was not transformed. I did not develop dragon scale or the ability to breathe fire. I did not become important in any conventional sense. What I had was the name, which was not a title and not a credential but something else, a being known. The Vethsoreth binding knew my name and my face and the fact of what I'd done, and in the very specific world of interspecies relations on the outer settlements, this turned out to matter in ways that were quiet and practical and not at all spectacular. Certain doors that might otherwise have taken months opened in weeks. Certain conversations that might have required intermediaries happened directly, not because of power, I had none in the conventional sense, but because of recognition, and recognition, I learned, is not a small thing. I saw Veth 3 times in the following years. The first time was brief, a binding transit through the Toval grid, official, nothing to do with me. She was with a larger group on the platform, and I was standing in the maintenance corridor running the grid's weekly diagnostic, and she saw me and held still for about 4 seconds and made a brief, low sound that I am reasonably confident was the hum sound, though it had deepened considerably since she was 7. I said hello. She moved on with the group. My supervisor asked who that was. I said a friend of the family. He accepted this without apparent curiosity, which was either incurious of him or very polite. The second time was more intentional. I was in the second year of the job, working a long contract on the outer grid's eastern reach, and a message came through the official binding communication channel. Not to me, to the regional coordinator's office, requesting that maintenance and success for a specific grid section be expedited for a binding survey. Quest named me by name. Keth Kalen Kale Doss, the message said, preferred liaison. The regional coordinator called me into her office and looked at me across her desk for a moment, in the way people look at things that don't fit their existing files. Do you want to tell me what this is? She said, handing me the message. They know me, I said. From before. From before, she said. Yes, she looked at me for another moment. How far before? I was 13, I said. She put the message down on her desk and looked at it, and then looked back at me. She was a practical woman. I'd worked with her for 18 months by then, and practical was the right word. And I watched her file this information alongside everything else she knew about me, which was grid systems, maintenance protocols, a reasonable understanding of the outer reach's AX codes, and no obvious reason for a binding notation. All right, she said, in the tone of someone who has decided that understanding a thing and acting on a thing are not the same requirement. She approved the expedited access and sent me to handle the liaison work. The survey team's lead was the ash-gray one, the one who had laughed in my south field 19 years ago. He looked different from a distance. Up close, in daylight, the charcoal of his crest had more depth to it, more complexity, the kind of layering that comes with years. He was larger than I remembered, though I suspect my 13-year-old scale was the problem, not his growth. He stood at the access gate and looked at me for a long moment with the settled amber eyes. Keth Kalen, he said. Kale is fine, I said. Keth Kalen is fine also, he said, with the specific inflection of someone making a distinction they consider important. Fair enough, I said. We went through the grid access together, and I showed him the sections, and he asked competent, specific questions about the maintenance schedules, and I answered them. And when it was done, he looked at me in the way the binding members did, entire, not missing things, and he said, "The maintenance was timely, we will note this." "That's my job," I said. "Yes," he said, "we know." There was a pause that had the same quality as the pauses in the south field. Not empty, not awkward, but thinking, he said. "She asks after you sometimes. Kethvel." "Kethvel," I said. "What you called Veth," he said, "in the shed. Her formal name is Kethvel Sora now. She uses Kethvel within the binding. She asks after you." I didn't say anything for a moment. "Tell her hello," I said. "From me." He made the deep resonant sound, the laugh, the one I'd first heard in the south field. "I will tell her Kethkeln sends his greetings," he said. "She's will be pleased." I walked back to the regional coordinator's office and filed the access report and went home and sat in my kitchen for a while, thinking about a 7-year-old in a culvert with a forced wing, and about an adult with a formal name and a place in a binding, asking after someone she'd known in a shed when she was small. It was not a bad thing to sit with. Not a bad thing at all. Third time was the last time. I was 41. The contact came through channels that were by then more familiar to me. I had been a binding recognized liaison for 11 years by that point, which had required some paperwork on the coalition side, and a great deal of being looked at across desks by people whose files didn't accommodate what they were looking at, but which had mostly resolved into a functional arrangement that served the practical work of keeping systems running. A message arrived at my home address, not my work address, my home, and it was from Drathcora directly, not through an intermediary, and it said the following, in Continental Standard, with impeccable vowels: Vel Kethsora has passed from the binding. The branch endures. The matriarch designate is Keth Vel, called Sora, who sends her greetings to Keth Kalin. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at this message for a while. The blue-black dragon, Veth's mother, the one who had come through the shed door carefully, folding her wings, making herself as small as the space allowed. I wrote back. I wrote, "Sorry for the binding's loss. She was extraordinary. Please carry that to the branch." Drathcora replied the following day. She wrote, "It is carried." And then, Kethvel asks that you know her wing carries no old damage. The old damage was tended before it could become permanent. She asks that Keth Kalin know this. I read that twice. Then I put the message down and looked out the kitchen window at the morning, which was bright and specific autumn light frost-thinking air. Good, I said, to the window. It was still, I think, my best word. My sister is a veterinarian. She's been practicing for 22 years, and she has, in the last decade, expanded her practice to include what the licensing board somewhat awkwardly classifies as large draconic species, which means she is one of approximately 30 licensed practitioners in the settlement cluster who can be called when a binding member needs medical attention that the binding's own healers can't provide. She carries a veterinary handbook that is not from 1987 and is explicitly written for dragon physiology. She has better information than I had. She gets better outcomes. She has never once brought this up at a family dinner without the look on her face. That means she has been thinking about the toad. Parents are retired. My father still does maintenance work on the local grid, informally, because he is my father and can't quite stop. My mother volunteers 3 days a week at the district library and has developed, over the years, an organizational system for their reference section that is genuinely extraordinary in its precision and that she has never explained to anyone's complete satisfaction. None of them were transformed by what happened in the South Field on a Tuesday in late autumn when I was 13. None of them became important in the conventional sense. They remained who they were, careful, practical, quietly competent people who did what the morning required and didn't make more of things than the things were. I don't know that I'm different from them in any significant way. I stayed in a doorway. I wrapped a wing. I read agricultural regulation documents aloud to an injured hatchling in an equipment shed while she slept. That's the whole of it, if you want the stripped version. But I have been thinking, in the 50 years since that morning, about what Drathcora meant by reasons that cannot be explained on a form. Because I have spent a career explaining things on forms, grid maintenance assessments, liaison documentation, interspecies coordination requests, and I'm reasonably good at it, and I know the value of a form that says what it means. But I also know what falls outside the boxes. What falls outside the boxes is the part that isn't about metrics or outcomes or filing systems. It's the part where you stand in a doorway with a pitchfork because something behind you is afraid, and you don't think it's right to leave. Not brave, calculated, not strategic, just not right to leave. Keth Kalin, the one who stands in a doorway for reasons that cannot be explained on a form. I've thought about whether I earned that name or whether it was given too easily. Whether a 13-year-old with a pitchfork and a 1987 veterinary handbook and no clear plan constitutes the kind of thing a name like that should attach to. I've decided in the considered opinion of my 63-year-old self that this is the wrong question. The name isn't a grade. It isn't an assessment of quality. It's a record. Someone was here and they did this thing, and the doing of it was witnessed, and it mattered. That's what a recognition is, not a verdict. A record. Veth is Kethvel now, matriarch designate, the Sora branch. Whatever that means, in the full weight of the Veth Sorath binding, which is more weight than I have ever fully understood, and which I have accepted is not mine to fully understand. She carries no old damage in the wing. The old damage was tended before it could become permanent. I did that. I, 13 years old, with canvas and a 1987 handbook, and a complete absence of any expertise, tended something before it became permanent, and the thing that might have been permanently damaged is instead whole, and leading a branch of the binding, and presumably going about her life in ways that are entirely beyond my knowledge. That is not nothing. I go out to the south field sometimes in the autumn, when the light is flat and white and the frost is thinking about settling. The culvert is still there. The equipment shed was replaced years ago. Proper construction, insulated electricity. The grain bags are gone. The old stove is gone. Pitchfork is still on its nail. I moved it there years ago, from the old shed to the new one. My sister knows it's there, and has never asked me to explain it, which means she already understands the answer. The morning light still comes in through the east window. I hang the pitchfork back on its nail and I go inside. That's the whole of the story. The stripped version and the other kind both.